and welcome everyone back. Now we are at the last session, at the last keynote of our wonderful OSS 2020. And last but not the least, we have a presentation by Marta Piekarska, who is a director of ecosystem at Hyperledger, and she studied in Warsaw and Berlin, and she has a double master and PhD in computer science. She's an expert of privacy, security, and is also within the Linux Foundation. I don't want to take too much of our time. Instead of letting immediately Marta to talk, to introduce herself and to give us her very interesting talk. Marta, please. You need to unmute yourself.
Yes. Oh, thank you. Someone unmuted me. Thank you. Thank you for the invite. I'm really excited. It's still, a new world to be giving talks online. I actually quite regret it because I really wanted to go to Nopolis, and I was very hoping that one day I'll see this incredible place. But next time, I guess. Thank you. So I will start sharing my screen so that you can follow my slides, and hopefully that will work. Here we go. Can you see my screen?
Yes, it's great. Yes, everything's okay.
Yes, wonderful. So, it's an OSS Con. What can you talk about? Apparently open source. That's kind of, my husband asked me today, what is your talk about? And I said, well, open source and working with open source. He's like, right, this is the whole conference about it? Like, yeah. So as it was mentioned, I'm director of ecosystem for Hyperledger. I've been in the blockchain space for 5 years. And I'm still exploring it, and I still have no idea what is happening. And I was hoping to earn some money on the halving, and yet I didn't. So obviously, in no way am I close to being an expert in that field. But I do enjoy what I do, and I've been fascinated by the open source and by blockchain forever. It's an incredibly interesting combination. And it starts with the fact that collaboration is hard. It is, try to decide what you want to eat, and now try to find a spot to eat, and then convince other people to come with you. It's impossible. And that's just a simple thing like going to a restaurant or ordering delivery these days. When it comes to, getting to work together in a company, when it comes to collaborating on a project, it's even harder. And that kind of is one of the bigger challenges of open source, but it's a challenge that open source is trying to address. So I really love XKCD. That's kind of why it's here. Open source, I define open source as a very innovative method that brings people together and encourages them to lead by doing things. And this is one of the biggest differences between open source and traditional software and business practices. And of course, when you want to do this and use open source software in a business for businesses, you do need to change the philosophy, and it doesn't necessarily come naturally. Something that we see very strongly in the Linux Foundation is that many companies join the Linux Foundation, believe in open source and using open source, but actually they never contribute back. They want to use open source, but they don't understand that it's a give and take kind of game. Linux Foundation was started 20 years ago to bring an ecosystem around using open source. So I like to say that initially we were created to address the problem of what happens if Linus Torvalds gets hit by a bus. There were loads of developers that were developing core Linux, and they've been working hard, but Linus Torvalds was the center of gravity. And that's not feasible, because one of the biggest advantages of open source is that there is no one center of gravity. You want people to collaborate, and if one person leaves, there are many others who will take over the work. Or in terms of companies, if one company backs out, there will be other companies that will be able to take on this investment. So we've been dedicated to building those sustainable ecosystems and bringing companies to work together in on different projects. We hope that we are creating the largest shared technology investment in the history. We'll see. You know, over 20 years, we have grown quite a bit. So what started with core Linux today is over 120 different projects, all the way from very small ones that nobody knows about, like recently launched Trust over IP project, or LF Energy, another one of those, all the way to projects that are very famous, like Node.js, Cloud Native Computing Foundation, LF Networking. These are very, very big and renowned projects. The Linux Foundation has been working on those projects under kind of an umbrella idea. But we are not the only open source initiative out there, of course. You have loads of other foundation and projects like Open Innovation Framework, Software Freedom Law Center, that is one is focusing on law. Apache, actually the Apache Foundation is one that has been started by Brian Bellendorf, the executive director of Hyperledger, and many others. So there are many advantages, obviously, of why companies should be working with open source. The big advantage is the fact that you have you have control, you have flexibility, and the code is reliable. The cost as such is a secondary matter, in my opinion, because obviously you will still need to introduce developer team to work on that open source and hopefully to contribute back. But the longevity of the code, the fact that you can make sure that if you're using some kind of a framework or some kind of a tool, it's no longer the case that if the developer that has been working on it decides to go to another place or changes jobs or whatever, that you're left with no tech support. There is always a community around those projects. We all are of the age that we've played some games back in the day, and we tried to, we got really attached to this one or another game, and then Microsoft sold the company or something like that happened, the company got acquired, but the product was no longer there, and there was no way to continue playing that game. With open source games, other developers, other passionate people do take over and do make sure that the project lives on. And there are reasons to set up open source offices. So while many companies today use open source projects, and as I mentioned, there are not many companies that actually have open source offices that define the policy around open source. And this is one of the big challenges for us that work with those companies, because many times developers or employees of a company will not know what is the company's policy, how should they behave around open source, what is allowed, what is not allowed, and so on and so forth. We use open source everywhere, but open source is much more than code. These are documents, guidelines, standards. These all could be published under open source. So if a company says, well, we are not really a tech company, it doesn't matter. You can contribute to open source and you can help changing the world with open source in many ways. And without guidance, employees do feel scared and to act and discouraged from innovation and taking actions. Now, interestingly, being in the blockchain space as well as open source, I went ahead and did some research. And if you look at the GitHub repository of how many projects or projects in general have been hosted on GitHub, open source projects, that's the graph on the right, and you compare that with the number of projects within the blockchain space, you clearly see a massive growth when blockchain launched or started. And that's kind of where Hyperledger started as well. In 2016, set of companies that already were collaborating with the Linux Foundation, about 30 of them, came to Jim Zemlin, the executive director of the Linux Foundation, and said, Jim, there's this whole Bitcoin thing going on, but we really want to do something that is not really cryptocurrency related. We would like to see if this technology applies to our businesses. And we feel like Linux Foundation is the right place to start that. And that's where Hyperledger started. It started 4 years ago as an answer to the enterprise side of the back then cryptocurrency, but broader blockchain space. Initially, it was thought to be more of a standardization body, but very quickly we realized that what we want to do is we want to build blockchain technologies for business. We want to be the center of excellence and bring people together to work on frameworks, tools, and code bases, not just documents. And Hyperledger is 100% open source. We are never pay to play. You can participate as an individual and as an employee of a company that is not a member, or as a corporate member. And we do embrace what we preach, which is leading by doing. The more you do, the louder your voice is. You can become part of even the technical steering committee without being a member company. In fact, it's the opposite. You need to show your technical excellence in order to be able to participate in the technical community, to be or put yourself up for a vote for the technical steering committee, which governs Hyperledger's direction in terms of the development of frameworks and tools. We have a so-called greenhouse approach to what we do. This, I didn't put in this slide here, but I have a comparison slide of how Hyperledger looked like when I first started 3.5 years ago, and how it looks now, which is this. In fact, we just launched another library just yesterday, which is still missing because we don't have a logo for them. That's Hyperledger Cactus. So what it means that we have a greenhouse approach. It means that we want to encourage the community, and anybody can come with a seed of their idea to Hyperledger Technical Steering Committee and say, I have this idea, I would like to plant it in your heads, and if the community then takes it up and helps foster that plant by contributing code, working on it, doing some kind of marketing around it, and so on and so forth, it will bloom to a beautiful plant where everybody can benefit from its fruits. And that's where you have the maturity of and production ready code. We over the time, we kind of started dividing our greenhouse into several categories. So you have the distributed ledgers, which are frameworks for building your solutions on top of those. So these are not ready to kind of out of the box setup thing that you can use to do reconciliation, financial reconciliation, or handle healthcare records. These are kind of set of guidelines and I'd say kind of the definition of the consensus mechanism, the governance models, the language approach to smart contracts. So kind of like a skeleton that you then fill out and adjust to your solution and your use case. If you know, I'm sure many of you have done this before, where you wanted to make a tart or a cake, and you went to the shop and you kind of bought the ready-made sponge or like a shortcut pastry, then you roll out and blind bake and put toppings on top of it. That's kind of what we do. We provide that sponge that you can then turn into whatever you want. Then we have libraries. Libraries are common code bases that should be reused, hopefully will be reused by different distributed ledgers within Hyperledger, but also outside of Hyperledger. And these would be things like, for instance, Hyperledger Ursa, which is our cryptographic library. Hyperledger Aries is a project focusing on building identity protocols that you can use with Hyperledger Indy or with other blockchains out there. And then, of course, you have tools that allow you to kind of do the benchmarking, to analyze what is happening, and so on. Two interesting things that we have is Hyperledger Grid, which is our only domain-specific project. This one is focusing on supply chain. And then there's Hyperledger Labs, which is our kind of R&D center, where if you went to a conference or to a hackathon and you coded out something and you're kind of excited about it, but you don't want to just keep it on your private repository, you want to grow the community around it, you can propose it as a Hyperledger lab, and we help you by providing the infrastructure to develop this code, obviously without any guarantees. It's not, we don't do code reviews of that. It's up to you and your community to do that. Our goals are very clear. We want to create enterprise-grade software and provide community-driven infrastructures. So we don't sell anything and we don't produce anything as such. There are no developers on Hyperledger staff. I mean, some of us can code, but we are not coding on our paid time. We do it for fun. We want to build the community, build technical communities, and educate the public about the market opportunity for blockchain technology and about how can you successfully create solutions using blockchain or distributed ledgers. There are many ways to work or get engaged with Hyperledger. I encourage you to check out the GitHub and the wiki. So we have kind of three types of ways that you can approach Hyperledger. There is the go to the website, and that's more business oriented. You'll get some resources, videos, webinars, and stuff like that. If you want to see what the community is working on actively and kind of get more involved, you would go to the wiki. That's where, you know, it's more kind of lively, updatable by anybody resource. And then, of course, if you want to actually start coding, then go to GitHub and start reporting bugs or just fixing bugs. We also have a lot of ways for people to engage even from not technical communities. And true to spirit, all of our special interest groups and working groups are open to public. There are no limits to who can participate. All of these groups meet on Zoom calls. Even before coronavirus, they also met on Zoom calls. And we have the special interest groups focus on verticals, focus on different the business lines and how blockchain can help that particular business. Now, we also have working groups that focus on the technology and cut cross verticals. So, you know, architecture working group or identity, performance, and scalability, they have nothing to do with the particular healthcare industry or supply chain industry. They focus on a particular problem within the distributed ledger space. As I said, we are open to training, or we want to educate the public, and to this end we have launched several certification projects and also free online courses. So if you're interested to learn more or to get more involved and get professional certification, you can always check that out. So now the question is really, does it work? does it actually make sense to do all of this? I'd say that Hyperledger is a choose your own adventure kind of thing, like any open source project, really, and like yeah, any open source code base. You need to decide if you want to contribute, and you only can participate in open source community if you are contributing. You can't just take. I can't underline it enough how important it is for you to give back as well as take. Because if everybody will take, nobody will be building this thing and it will fall apart. But there are so many ways that you can contribute. Very often in open source projects, we talk about code contributions and how fixing bugs is the only way to contribute to open source project, which is not true. As I said, open source is much more than just code. You can write write documents, you can participate in meetings and contribute your intellectual intellect and your thoughts to the community. You can of course always do the code, but there are so many more things that are worth exploring. No. I'm seeing some questions here. I'm not sure if I should be answering the questions while I talk or later. So I guess I'll take them towards the end. So yeah, going back to if it works. We launched 4 years ago. We have 14 different projects. We have 3 production releases. And we have a massive community. I mean, 67,000 meetup participants across 170 meetups worldwide. We see Hyperledger and open source booming everywhere. In fact, Forbes ran the blockchain 50, so what top 50 projects that are using blockchain in the enterprise setting, and over half of it was built using Hyperledger code bases. And even if you look further, 22 of them included Ethereum and only 11 included Corda, which is not really an open source project. So it's really great to see that open source is the prevailing choice among enterprises. This is also why, without us moving a finger and without actually developers, core developers doing anything, Hyperledger Fabric has been or is now available on all major clouds, because cloud providers understood that they have to do they have to make the move and they have to adopt open source strategy and develop plugins or make sure that Hyperledger Fabric nodes can run on their clouds. That's another, to follow up on the previous one on Forbes 50, you can see massive names here. I mean, BMW, Daimler, Honeywell, all of those are very big companies that are embracing open source. One of our newest cross-industry case study, and I would like to tell you a bit more about the case studies, because that's always interesting, I think, is Honeywell and their aerospace marketplace. This is an interesting story because Honeywell, being one of the bigger aerospace companies, has been struggling with dealing with spare parts. Actually, most airplane parts are not fresh produced. They are reused from other airplanes and they are spread all over the world. Every hour of an airplane grounded, and that's why current situation is so terrible for the industry, aerospace industry, every hour results in thousands and hundreds of thousands of lost dollars. So you can't really ground a plane and wait for and then start looking for the part that you need to fix the plane, and then kind of verify where if this is an authentic part or not, and then look at things like how long will it ship and so on and so forth. So, but this is how it used to be. It was literally done in a book way and phoning up people. So they've created a marketplace that is a bit like an Amazon or an eBay for airplane parts among the big companies, where you can online check and verify the parts, where they are coming from. Blockchain is used as an immutable record of where everything is, and allows for kind of a single source of information that is shared among all participants and can be trusted. Another interesting project is CU Ledger. This is a very big, sorry, I'm missing a word. A very big institution that brings all credit unions together. And they've developed MyCUID, which is a global identity solution. And in fact, although, again, credit unions are not incredibly modern and not incredibly kind of forward thinking, they have embraced it. And most credit unions nowadays are using MyCUID to do mobile banking authentication, to do KYC and onboarding, to call center authentication, and many, many more. Another project, and actually we have a very good webinar that has been recently done by Ricardo from Scantros on the food supply chain and tracing pork. That this is something that has been done with Unilever, and it's a solution that provides reports and analysis and recommendations based on the big data from consumers. It is very interesting because it allows you to do better loyalty programs. But for Knorr, which is the Unilever brand that was working on it, it was also allowed to find massive, and unfortunately I know the numbers, but I can't share the numbers of how big it is, but it was a very very significant number of forgery. So turned out that the same boxes of Knorr products have been sold in several different places in the world at the same time, because every single box has a unique QR code, and it turned out that these QR codes were not so unique. So that's turning something that is a cool kind of gimmick into significant ROI for the companies. Another interesting, very different project. This one actually, we will have a webinar next week on the 20th of May. Around this particular project, which was building the floor is the name of the project, and it's blockchain technology partners that created blockchain securities lending platform together with Tel Aviv Stock Exchange. They are using Hyperledger Sawtooth, similarly to the previous use case from Scantros, and their platform enables peer-to-peer lending and supports a wide range of contracts. I am really passionate about things that actually help to save the world, and so the stuff around sustainability. So I do like a Circular's use case, which is tracking and tracing mining of tantalum, which is a rare metal. It's used to create to do batteries. So they've managed to create a whole system whereby working with Volvo and Daimler, where these big companies actually forced all of their suppliers, and their suppliers forced their suppliers to using that blockchain-based solution, Hyperledger Fabric-based solution, in order to make sure that the metal is mined, transported, and processed under the OECD-approved conditions, which is great. There, you must have heard, because that's one of the bigger and one of the first use cases, was around the diamond supply chain and stuff that Everledger did on diamond supply chain, which is also based on Hyperledger Fabric. On the other hand, another food example, it seems like food is a really good space for using distributed ledgers. This one is from China. Their platform built by Chain Nova. They actually have 10% of rice production in China now is running through their blockchain big farm, which allows you to trace rice within China. And this helps with monitoring the true origin of rice and the prices of rice, and gets gets money right to the rice producers or farmers, rather than getting stuck in the middle of the supply chain, where the people that do the hard work never actually see the real money. There is a platform called eVisible, another one in China, that is an IoT and blockchain integrated application that enables creation of traceable data and visibility and control of capital during the whole trading process. So it's, combining different technology, which is also what we see as the future. I mentioned that we have just launched a new project within the Linux Foundation, not within the Hyperledger, that is called Trust Over IP Foundation. That actually is, this org book was the stepping stone and one of the first kind of the originating projects that encouraged building Trust Over IP Foundation. This is widely used by the government of British Columbia, so in Canada, to create a trusted digital network of verifiable data about organizations, so that you, as a company, you can actually track other companies that you're working with. You can verify their identity, verify that they are honest, and check their reputation. There are so many more use cases. I mean, I could just talk your ear off. There is the letters of credit, which is impressive because of the numbers. Their first letter of credit transaction was 100 million, worth 100 million, which is a nice number. And there is again an identity space, which is done by Kiwa, which is a very old company that focuses on micro lending, and they've built, based on Hyperledger Indy, a self-sovereign and privacy-first credit bureau for Sierra Leone. In Sierra Leone, the only very small number of people had bank accounts prior to their solution, and the rates are incredibly high. So, because the lending rates in Sierra Leone are about 30%, which is massively high, and that's a blocker to financial participation. Finally, I think this is my last use case. I promised that I wouldn't speak more than 30 minutes to give you time for questions. So it's WeTrade, which is a consortium of major banks. Currently, there are 12 different banks that focuses on enabling and helping small and medium enterprises to get credit and to trade between each other. So they are enabling to accurately track accurately the trading position, order to settlement, and enable order to settlement control. There is risk coverage and track and trace options, and they are in production. The banks mentioned here are using it on daily basis, and seems like it's a very productive and interesting project. So if you want to learn more, there we have the member-only vendor directory. So a vendor directory where we list our members, and you can search through what they offer and what they build, and geographies. More importantly, we have Blockchain Showcase, which is open to everybody, and you can tell us, and we will publish it on our website, about your project built using Hyperledger technologies. So if any of you right now is developing something and it's in a POC pilot, doesn't matter. I did include a link here because we want to tell the world that this technology is real and that it is, that people are actively using it, because there's a lot of skepticism out there, as I'm sure you are aware. And that is it. So thank you for listening to me. I will now go over to questions, but also I think we have the raise hand option as well, if you want to use that.
Yeah. So I would like to start with some selection of the questions. The first one is from Nikita Kostienko, who asks you, does the decrease in interest to the blockchain after the great cryptocurrency price fail caused a similar decrease of the contribution to Hyperledger?
No, not at all. We are completely cryptocurrency kind of not agnostic or independent, because it's not our thing. There has been a moment in alpha version of Fabric 2.0 where we've discussed the developers discussed adding a Fab token, which would be a token capability to Hyperledger Fabric. But actually, it was removed from the alpha version because there was so little interest in it, or not enough people were wanting to develop it. So no, there is no connection there. There is a connection, of course, between the global recession that we have right now and companies struggling to kind of tie the ends together, and obviously then developers have less time to contribute back to Hyperledger. They are fighting for their survivor, but hopefully this will be something that is passing. I would say that we have year to year, we have a very stable number of contributions, very similar number of contributions.
Wow, thanks a lot. That was very interesting. The second question is, how can we make open source project viable? There are so many dead open source projects. What is your suggestion?
Yeah, I see that from Andre here. You know what? It's really hard. I think that I mentioned GitHub. I think that this is one of the bigger challenges of GitHub, is that there are so many projects and nobody's pruning it. That's something that we kind of faced with Hyperledger Labs, where we were really worried and had a moment where people would submit Hyperledger lab to the labs, or project to the labs, and then it would not go anywhere. And it's a matter of curation and governance on our side to say, okay, well, if nobody's wanting to work on this project, we do need to cut it. I think that what we need to do is educate people on the fact that open source projects exist only when there is interest and active participation. It is not like a product where you can say, well, I want this functionality, just build it for me, right? And then, or kind of rely on the fact that because someone said something, this will become a functionality in the project. A lot of it is driven by, again, if you want it, build it yourself, or find someone who will build it for you and contribute it back. It is not a matter of putting in business requirements. These are, unless you're buying something from a company, these are not products.
Well, thank you. But the question is then, why should a person contribute to an open source project? Is it a personal advertisement?
I think that you should, if you want several things. If you are using that project, it's just the right thing to do. If if you work, you take, say, Hyperledger Indy to build your identity solution, and find bugs and then fix the bugs, but don't bring it back to the community, it's just not a very nice thing to do, is it? It's like, keeping it to yourself and you got it for anyway for free, right? It's not okay. But ethics aside, I think that as a young developer, you should think of it as building your portfolio. When you're an artist, you kind of collect together paintings and or music that you've built that was published, and or if you're a writer, all of the articles you've published, and that creates kind of your reputation. As a developer, you should be doing the same thing. And when you contribute to open source, there are many more people who will take a look at it, will give you feedback, so you'll be able to learn. But also, you can then prove that quality of your work is accepted by people that have very high standards.
Wow, thank you. Artyom has a question. You need to unmute yourself, Artyom. Artyom, you need to unmute yourself.
Sorry, I have the problems with the sound all the time. So I said that it was my question, and actually I tried to ask it initially in the morning, and I tried to ask Mirko about it. What forced the people to contribute? I thought maybe, okay, it's a willingness to become more experienced, but you said that technical experience already required in order to contribute to the projects of Hyperledger, for example. So then what is the reason why they sitting at the weekends, as Mirko said during his speech? Why they sit in the weekends and contribute to the project? What is this force?
Well, it's it's a challenging question to answer, because obviously we are all driven by different motivations, right? Why do it? As I said, because you want to develop your capabilities, your abilities. You want to learn more. You want to help build something that you're proud of. If your only motivation is to earn money, then obviously, nobody will pay you for contributing to open source unless you find a company, say like you'd work for IBM, they are contributing to Hyperledger Fabric, Hyperledger Indy, and Hyperledger Ursa. So they have actually developers that are being paid to contribute back to Hyperledger, or Oracle does the same thing. But otherwise, if you're just an individual, I would say that it's mostly to just build, to do something that you want, that you like.
Okay.
No, it's just, because I would ask the other way around. Why not? Why wouldn't you contribute?
No, actually, probably I will, but in general.
Yeah. Yeah, but why would like an abstract person, an abstract you, if you're building something and you're already kind of developing using the code, like you've been using this thing and you're fixing it or you're not fixing it, you have something that you've built around it, why wouldn't you give it back to the community? Unless it's an IP that you want to keep for yourself and then sell or something like that, obviously, that is a different story. But if you're already improving a project for yourself, then why not give it back to the other people, right? It doesn't cost you extra.
Let me say, Tony has a comment back on this. Tony.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Tony,
good morning, good afternoon. Interesting talk. I've known Brian for a long time, so I've followed the project somewhat. Mm-hmm. So I think your point about people being paid is a good one, and it's true not only of Hyperledger but of many other projects. People have contributed to OpenOffice, now LibreOffice. People have contributed the Eclipse Foundation when it started, of course. Paid 100 and some odd people who were working for IBM. So that's a model. There are two other things that are worth mentioning. One is that a lot of companies that are hiring are looking at people's GitHub pages. They want to see, hey, does this person participate? What does that person's code look like? Do they participate in communities? These are usually at least as good ways of evaluating people's skills as having them sit in front of you and, you know, give them a quiz of some sort. So that's one piece, and then I have a second piece. Go ahead.
No. I completely agree. That's what I was saying about the portfolio thing, building your portfolio. It is if you're a developer, it is really important that you can show a proven track record of successfully contributing to projects.
Of course, in the US, people would say that you're building your brand. Using creating a portfolio. So the other thing has to do with the business side of open source systems. There's been all this battle over licenses and over commercialization. Redis is a very good example, but there are, I don't know, roughly 100 open source companies that have book valuations of $500 million, and all these companies contribute a version of their software to the community, but their business model is to sell subscriptions and license services to the quote professional version of the product. That's a little bit of a perversion of open source, but there's certainly a lot of that going on. Do you have any thoughts on this?
To be honest, when I hear things like, oh, we are looking to partially open source our project, I mean, it's open source is a bit like, you know, like marriage. Either you're married or you're not. You can't be partially married.
But there's this open marriage stuff.
You know, I'm not gonna dive there, but yes, indeed. I mean, sure. I think that this is. I'm not very fond of it. I think that if you're doing things like we are offering a version that is a bit crappy, but it's open source, and then if you want the good version, we'll sell it to you. It's a bit like, you know, dealer on the street trying to kind of say, oh, I'm going to give you this free sample, but if you really like my stuff, then you have to pay me more. That's not okay in some ways. If it is the case that you're saying, I'm using open source and building products that are kind of helping your business or something like that, something like Red Hat is doing, right? That I think is, you know, it's a valid model. It's people need to earn money, and we can't all just be hippies. So yeah, that's fair. I just don't like the whole thing of, you know, I will give you a bit, but not all, and you know that there's this better version, but if you don't want to pay me, you're not going to get it.
Right. Well, the issue for companies often is support. So in fact, you can pay Red Hat for Red Hat Enterprise Linux, but if you're doing your own academic research or just playing around, you can go download CentOS, which is exactly the same code. It's free, but it doesn't come with support. And so if you're putting a product out built on open source, you know, a lot of people are willing to pay the subscription fee to be able to contact the support team at whatever hour of the day or night.
Yeah, no, and that's fair. You know, that's more kind of consultancy or tech support business. If you do it on your product, or if you do it on open source, we all need support, right?
Right.
So, yeah.
Thank you.
There's a question from Alberto that I wanted to address, which is what about the effects of malicious contributors? How can you manage them? And Hyperledger is very critical. How can you manage them? Well, the thing is that open source doesn't mean that you just come and dump your code. There is a process where you have you submit a contribution or a pull request, and then the maintainers will verify it or take a look at it and decide if this should be accepted or not. Maintainers are chosen from the community of long-standing developers, and are, you know, the kind of the valuable elderly, or you know, the circle of the most experienced and trustworthy developers. So you don't become a maintainer just like that. You can't pay yourself, pay your way to be a maintainer. You actually have to show excellence of sorts in that particular project. And so you can't then be a malicious contributor, because I mean, depends on what you mean by malicious contributor. Maybe I'll start there. In terms of contributing malicious code or something like that, that's taken care of by the governance of open source projects. Now, there are challenges around maliciousness in terms of destroying the community. So people who are just toxic in some ways, that start kind of creating some kind of yeah, creating some kind of negative spin around the project, start manipulating, and so on and so forth. I would say that this is a big problem. This is a general big problem. That's why, for instance, in Hyperledger, but in most open source projects, you do have code of conduct, and we do encourage the community to pick out malicious actors and call them out. That's why we in Hyperledger exist, to make sure that we have the discussion with that person, and to make sure that we weed them out and have a talk. Sometimes they are, you know, they're not even malicious, that they just don't know how to behave, and need some kind of a guidance there. So I think this is a matter of the community working together and collaborating towards building a healthy ecosystem. How much experience should you have to contribute in an open source project? If you're, yes, absolutely. It's you can be a beginner. I mean, we all started somewhere, right? We are not just brilliant developers. In fact, that's what I said when I had this graph of, you know, choose your own adventure, because I think that the best thing to do when you're a beginner, start contributing by providing your thoughts about, you know, what is missing, what features are missing. Participate in discussions. If there are things like working groups or special interest group, you are brilliant at something. Definitely, you know something, and your excellence will be valuable in that space. If you want to start learning a bit about coding, but you're not feeling comfortable fixing bugs, a lot of projects do have best first bugs list, so they will flag bugs that they think are very good for beginners to fix. But also start with helping with documentation. As you're using the code base, you will use the documentation, and you'll see that there are things that are unclear. You'll have to kind of go and figure them out yourself, or there will be things missing in general. So fix those things and send it over to the community and say, hey, you know, here I wrote 3 articles that will help people like me get started. And then, you know, you can translate the documentation. I find that in general, a great way to dive into any kind of space is to start translating the articles or documents about it, right? I've been passionate about several things in my life, and it helped me a lot to take on tasks of translating articles about those things, and that way kind of focusing on the topic and learning more about it.
Okay, so I think we have exhausted all the time. So let me join with everyone thanking Marta for the great talk and the great interaction during our discussion. So let's thank Marta virtually with all our way to do it virtually. And Marta, also you are invited to join, to come here, to visit us in Innopolis
Thank you.
anytime you want. Okay?
I am really, really looking forward to the time where I'll finally. I used to travel like about 45 weeks out of the year. I was like on the road almost all the time. So for me, it's just, I can't wait to get on the airplane and contribute to the global warming a bit.
Wait for invitation in this case.
Okay, guys, thank you so much for your time and inviting me. I'm very excited to be part of it, and I hope to see you online anytime soon.
Good. So thanks a lot, Marta. And now, unfortunately, we are at the end of our beautiful conference.